I spent 4 years quietly paying my parents' mortgage, their insurance, their credit cards, $87,000 total, while they never once said thank you. Christmas morning, my mother gathered everyone outside. Twinkling lights, Christmas music blasting, phone cameras ready. And there it was, a brand new white Porsche Cayenne with a giant red bow sitting in the driveway like a dream come true. For my sister Megan. She screamed. She cried. She hugged our parents like they'd just handed her the world. I stood behind everyone holding a bag of gifts I'd carefully chosen for them. $600 worth of love they'd never notice. Then came my turn. My mother handed me a small envelope. Inside, a worn $2 bill and a handwritten note that said, "You already have everything. Learn to be grateful." Megan laughed. "You don't even have a husband or kids. What would you need a nice car for?" I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I smiled, set down my gift bag, and walked out without a word. That night, when every payment I'd ever made suddenly stopped, their perfect Christmas collapsed. Have you ever loved a family that forgot you existed? My name is Lindsay Floyd. I'm 35 years old, a senior financial manager at an insurance company in Cincinnati. And for the past 4 years, I've been the invisible backbone of a family that doesn't even know I exist. The drive from Cincinnati to Columbus takes about 2 hours on a good day. On Christmas Eve, with holiday traffic crawling along I-71, it took me closer to 3. 3 hours alone with my thoughts, my doubts, and the small leather notebook sitting in my purse like a secret I'd been carrying for far too long. That notebook contained every payment I'd made for my family since December 4 years ago, every mortgage payment when my father fell behind, every credit card bill I quietly covered, every emergency that somehow always landed in my lap. The total as of last month was $87,340. I'd kept meticulous records because that's what financial managers do. We track numbers. We document everything. We prepare for the day when the truth finally needs to come out. No one in my family knew that notebook existed, just like no one seemed to know I existed unless they needed something. It started 4 years ago when my mother had a minor stroke. I rushed to the hospital and sat by her bed for 3 days straight. On the second night, she grabbed my hand and looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Lindsay, you're the strongest one in this family," she whispered. "Promise me you'll keep everyone standing while I recover. Promise me." What daughter says no to that? So I started paying. Home insurance at $1,200 a month because my parents had let it lapse. My father's credit cards, which somehow accumulated $800 to $1,500 in new charges every single month. Emergency roof repairs, medical bills that insurance didn't cover, and eventually my younger sister Megan's credit card bills because she was going through a hard time and needed support. Megan is 32 years old. She's worked part-time in retail for as long as I can remember, bouncing from job to job every few months because nothing ever felt right for her. My parents have always called her the sensitive one, who needs protection from the harsh realities of life. Megan gets patience. Megan gets understanding. Megan gets second and third and fourth chances. I get silence. 2 years ago, I overheard a conversation that still burns in my chest. I'd arrived early for Sunday dinner and paused outside the kitchen door when I heard my name. Megan's voice casual and careless. "Lindsay has money. Let her handle it. I'm still building my life." My mother's response was even worse. She laughed softly and said, "You're right, sweetheart. Lindsay's always been fine on her own." Fine on her own. As if needing nothing meant deserving nothing. This year, though, something shifted. My mother called in early December, her voice unusually soft. "I want this Christmas to be special," she said. "A healing Christmas, for all of us to come together as a family again." I didn't believe her. Not really. But some small, stubborn part of me, the part that still remembered being a little girl who just wanted her mother to see her, that part wanted to give it one last chance, one final test to answer the question I'd been avoiding for years. Was this family worth everything I'd sacrificed? So I packed my car with carefully chosen gifts. A cashmere scarf for my mother, a golf accessory set for my father, a delicate bracelet for Megan. Nearly $600 of love wrapped in pretty paper, because even after everything, I still hoped. But just a few hours after walking through that front door, I would realize that my mother's definition of healing was very different from what I had imagined. Christmas morning started with the smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls, the same breakfast my mother had made every December 25th since I was a child. For a brief moment, standing in the kitchen with a warm mug in my hands, I let myself believe that maybe this year really would be different. Maybe the healing my mother promised was actually possible. That hope lasted exactly 47 minutes. My father appeared in the doorway with a grin I hadn't seen in years. "Everyone grab your coats," he announced, clapping his hands together like a game show host about to reveal the grand prize. "We're going outside. Family tradition." I didn't remember any tradition that required going outside on Christmas morning, but I set down my coffee and followed along. My mother was already pulling on her jacket, her eyes bright with excitement. Megan bounced on her heels like a child, even though she was 32 years old. I grabbed the bag of gifts I'd brought from the living room, thinking maybe we were doing some kind of outdoor gift exchange this year. Something new, something special for this healing Christmas my mother had promised. The cold December air hit my face as we stepped onto the front porch. The house was decorated beautifully, lights twinkling along the roofline, a wreath on every window. But none of that mattered once I saw what was sitting in the driveway. A brand new white Porsche Cayenne gleamed under the winter sun. A giant red bow perched perfectly on top like something out of a luxury car commercial. My father had his phone out, already recording. My mother stood with her hands clasped under her chin, tears forming in her eyes. And Megan, my sister, who had never held a full-time job for more than 6 months, who still had her credit card bills paid by someone else, stood frozen with her mouth open in disbelief. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," my father said, his voice thick with emotion. "You deserve a fresh start." Megan screamed. Not a surprised gasp or a happy squeal, but a full scream that echoed down our quiet suburban street. She ran to the car, ran her hands over the hood, then sprinted back to throw herself into my parents' arms. All three of them stood there crying and hugging and laughing while Christmas music played from a speaker someone had set up on the porch. It was a production, a performance, a celebration of everything Megan was and everything I apparently was not. I stood behind them all, still holding my bag of $600 gifts, and not a single person turned around to look at me. After what felt like an eternity of photos and happy tears, and Megan sitting in the driver's seat pretending to steer, we finally went back inside. My hands were numb from the cold, but I don't think anyone noticed I wasn't wearing gloves. I set the gift bag down on the coffee table and watched my family settle into the living room, still buzzing with excitement over the card Sunday. "Dad," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady, "how much did that car cost?" My father puffed up with pride. $78,000. We used some of our retirement savings and took out a loan for the rest. But Megan's been through so much. She deserves something beautiful to help her start fresh. $78,000. The number hit me like a punch to the chest. I had sent home $87,000 over the past 4 years. $87,000 that I thought was keeping this family afloat, paying the bills they couldn't afford, covering the emergencies they couldn't handle. But they could afford a $78,000 car for Megan. They could drain their retirement and take out loans for my sister. All of those payments I made didn't save this family. They just freed up money so my parents could pour everything they had into their favorite daughter. "Lindsay, here's yours." My mother's voice cut through my spiral. She was holding out a small envelope with my name written on the front in her careful handwriting. I took it, expecting maybe a heartfelt card, an acknowledgement of everything I'd done, some small recognition that I mattered too. Inside was a worn $2 bill and a handwritten note. "You already have everything. Learn to appreciate the small things." I read those words 3 times, waiting for them to rearrange into something that made sense. $2. After 4 years of silently keeping this family standing, my Christmas gift was $2 and a lecture about gratitude. Megan leaned over my shoulder and laughed. "Oh, that's cute. But honestly, Lindsay, you don't have a husband or kids anyway. What would you even need a nice car for? $2 is plenty for someone with your lifestyle." The room went quiet for a moment, but no one corrected her. No one told Megan that was cruel. My mother even smiled slightly, as if my sister had made a valid point. I looked around at the three of them, these people I had sacrificed so much for, and I finally understood. I wasn't the strong one they counted on. I was just the invisible one they used. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I simply set the envelope on the coffee table next to the bag of gifts I'd brought for them. Gifts they would never know cost me $600 because they would never bother to ask. "Thank you, everyone," I said, my voice calm and clear. "I need to leave early." No one tried to stop me. No one asked why. My mother just nodded and said something about traffic being lighter if I left before noon. I grabbed my coat, walked out the front door, and climbed into my car without looking back at the Porsche or the twinkling lights or any of it. I sat in the driver's seat for a full minute, just breathing. Then I pulled out my phone and did something I should have done years ago. I opened my banking app and canceled every automatic payment I had set up for my family. The home insurance, my father's credit card, Megan's credit card, the monthly transfer that covered their emergencies. One by one, I deleted them all. 4 years of silent support erased in less than 5 minutes. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel sad. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt free. That evening, when a flood of payment failed notifications hit their phones, the Floyd family finally realized that I didn't just leave the living room. I left my role as their silent safety net, and I was never going back. I drove straight to my best friend Karen's house in Cincinnati that Christmas afternoon. She took one look at my face, handed me a glass of wine, and didn't ask any questions. That's the kind of friend Karen is. She let me sleep in her guest room, wrapped in blankets that smelled like lavender, with my phone turned to silent for the first time in 4 years. I didn't know exactly what was happening back in Columbus, but I learned every detail later, and I have to admit there was a certain satisfaction in hearing how quickly everything fell apart. December 26th started normally enough for the Floyd family. My father went to fill up the Porsche with gas, a special treat for Megan, so she could drive her new car around and show it off to her friends. But when he tried to pay at the pump, his credit card was declined. He tried a second card, declined. He called the bank from the gas station parking lot confused and embarrassed, only to learn that the automatic payments that had been covering his balance for years had suddenly stopped. Meanwhile, Megan discovered her phone service had been cut off. She couldn't post pictures of her new car on social media. She couldn't text her friends. She stormed into the house demanding to know what was going on, only to find my mother staring at her laptop with a pale face. An email had arrived that morning from their home insurance company. Payment overdue. Coverage at risk of cancellation. They called me 23 times that day. I know because I counted the missed calls later. 23 attempts to reach the daughter they had dismissed with $2 and a note about gratitude. I didn't answer a single one. I was sitting on Karen's couch, watching old movies and eating leftover Christmas cookies, feeling lighter than I had in years. By that evening, my father finally did something he should have done a long time ago. He logged into the family bank account and actually looked at the transaction history. What he found there changed everything. Page after page of payments, all originating from an account linked to my name. Roof repair, $12,000. Emergency room bills from my mother's stroke, $8,500. Credit card payoffs, $23,000 spread across multiple payments. Megan's credit card specifically, $15,000 over 4 years. The transfers for home insurance month after month after month. My father scrolled through years of records, watching the numbers add up, and by the time he reached the end, the total was $87,340. My mother broke down crying when she saw it. She kept saying my name over and over as if she couldn't believe what she was looking at. My father sat in silence, his face gray, unable to speak. And Megan, for the first time in her entire life, had absolutely nothing to say. December 27th brought the second revelation, and this one cut even deeper. My parents confronted Megan about the credit card payments. How could Lindsay have been paying your bills without you knowing? Megan tried to deflect at first, but my mother pressed harder, and finally under pressure, Megan cracked. I knew, she admitted, her voice small. I knew Lindsay was paying for things, but I thought that was between her and you guys. I didn't think it was my business. My mother stared at her in disbelief. You knew your sister was paying your credit card bills for 4 years, and you never said anything. You never thanked her. You never told us. Megan's defense only made things worse. She has money. She said the same excuse she had always used. I'm still building my life. I needed the support more than she did. Those words hung in the air like poison. The exact same words she had said 2 years ago, the words I overheard in the kitchen, the words that had slowly killed any hope I had that my sister saw me as anything more than a resource to be used. The argument that followed exposed the third truth, and this one came from my father. My mother kept repeating that she had always believed I was fine, that I didn't need anything extra, that I was the strong one who could take care of herself. My father finally snapped. "That's exactly why you agreed to sign that will," he said bitterly. Megan looked up confused. "What will—" The room went silent. My father rubbed his face with both hands, then reluctantly explained. 3 years ago, my parents had drafted a new will. In it, Megan was set to receive 90% of their estate. I would receive only 10%. The reasoning, my mother admitted quietly, was that I was already self-sufficient. I didn't need their help. Megan was the one who would struggle without support. That will was signed the same year I started sending money home, the same year I began quietly sacrificing my own savings to keep their family standing. They were planning to leave almost everything to Megan, while I was the one actually paying their bills. On December 28th, I finally broke my silence, but not with a phone call. I spent that morning at Karen's kitchen table, compiling everything I had kept in that little leather notebook, every receipt, every bank statement, every transfer confirmation. I organized it all into a 12-page document and sent it to my mother's email address with a simple message attached. The document spoke for itself. 4 years of payments laid out in black and white, impossible to deny or minimize. At the end, I wrote one final paragraph. I'm not sending this to ask for the money back. I'm sending it so you understand something important. I was never fine. I was never okay. I was just silent. I kept this family standing because Mom asked me to, and I did it without asking for anything in return. But silence is not the same as strength, and being used is not the same as being loved. Starting next month, I'm moving to Denver for a new position. I need to live my own life now. I hit send and closed my laptop. Karen squeezed my shoulder and poured me another cup of coffee. Outside her window, the winter sun was shining, and I realized I hadn't felt this peaceful in years. That 12-page document wasn't just a record of transactions. It was a silent indictment from a daughter who had loved her family through actions every single day for 4 years, while her family had loved her back with $2 and a note telling her to be grateful. The first week of January brought a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. I was staying at Karen's house, sleeping in her guest room, and slowly packing up my apartment for the move to Denver. Every morning I woke up without that familiar weight on my chest, without the anxiety of checking my phone for the next family emergency, without the quiet dread of being needed, but never appreciated. For 4 years, I had started every day wondering what crisis would land in my lap, what bill would need to be paid, what problem would require my money and my silence. Now I woke up to sunlight through Karen's curtains and the smell of coffee brewing downstairs, and I felt something I had almost forgotten was possible. I felt free. I kept my phone on silent most of the time, but I still checked the voicemails and text messages that poured in from Columbus. Not because I intended to respond, but because some part of me needed to witness the consequences of my silence. What I learned over those first few weeks of January was more satisfying than I ever expected. The financial collapse happened faster than even I had predicted. The bank called my parents about the Porsche loan on January 2nd, just 8 days after that humiliating Christmas morning. Without the cushion of my monthly payments keeping their other bills manageable, they had missed the first installment on Megan's $78,000 Christmas gift. The bank representative was polite but firm. They had 30 days to catch up on the payment, or the vehicle would be repossessed. My mother left me a voicemail about it that same afternoon, her voice tight with panic and confusion. "Lindsay, we need to talk. There's been some kind of mistake with the car loan. The bank is saying we missed a payment, but that can't be right. Please call us back so we can figure this out together." I listened to that message while drinking my morning coffee at Karen's kitchen table, and I felt nothing but calm. There was no mistake. There was just reality finally catching up to a family that had been living beyond their means on my back for 4 years. 3 days later, the home insurance company sent a final notice. Coverage would be canceled in 2 weeks if the overdue balance wasn't paid in full. My father apparently spent an entire afternoon on the phone trying to negotiate an extension, explaining that there had been a family emergency and they just needed a little more time. But without the automatic payments that had been flowing from my account for 4 years, they had no way to catch up on what they owed. The numbers simply didn't work anymore. The Hawaii vacation they had planned for New Year's was canceled entirely, the deposit forfeited, and the flights worthless. My mother had been bragging about that trip for months to everyone she knew, showing off photos of the oceanfront resort and talking about how much the family needed some quality time together in the sun. Now all of that was gone. According to the voicemails my mother left me over the following days, Megan cried for 2 days straight about the canceled vacation, as if missing a trip to Hawaii was the greatest tragedy anyone in history had ever been forced to endure. The family conflict that exploded in the wake of these consequences was something I only heard fragments of through voicemails and the occasional text message. But the picture that emerged was clear enough, and honestly, it was exactly what I had expected would happen once I stopped holding everything together. My father blamed my mother for spoiling Megan to the point where she couldn't function as a responsible adult. "You created the situation," he apparently shouted during one particularly heated argument. "You treated her like a princess her whole life, gave her everything she ever wanted, never made her work for anything, and now look where we are. We're about to lose our insurance because you couldn't say no to your precious baby girl." My mother fired back that he was the one who insisted on buying the Porsche in the first place, that he was the one who wanted to be the big hero, giving his daughter the car of her dreams, so he didn't get to stand there and put all the blame on her shoulders. They went back and forth like that for days, each one pointing fingers at the other, neither one willing to admit that they had both failed. Megan, caught in the middle of their constant fighting, refused to take any responsibility at all. She sent me a text message that I read but didn't answer. "This isn't fair, Lindsay. You chose to leave at the worst possible time just to get revenge on all of us. You could have talked to us. You could have told us you were struggling. Instead, you just disappeared and left us to deal with this mess. This is your fault, not mine." I stared at that message for a long time, reading it over and over again. My fault. After 4 years of quietly paying her credit card bills, without any recognition, covering her phone service, without any thanks, making sure she never had to face the consequences of her own financial choices, she still found a way to make herself the victim. She still found a way to blame me for her problems. I deleted the message without responding and went back to packing boxes for my move to Denver. Some people will never take responsibility for themselves, and I was done trying to carry them anyway. The reality check Megan had been avoiding her entire adult life finally arrived in the middle of January. My father called a family meeting and announced in no uncertain terms that they could no longer afford to make the payments on her car. She was on her own. Megan apparently panicked completely, crying and pleading and insisting that they couldn't do this to her, but for once in his life, my father held firm. Maybe watching his home insurance nearly get canceled had finally woken him up to the situation. For the first time in her 32 years of existence, my sister was forced to sit down with a calculator and actually figure out her income against her expenses. She worked part-time at a clothing boutique, earning maybe $1,500 a month on a good month less when hours got cut. The Porsche payment alone was over $1,000. Add in her phone bill, her gas, her car insurance, her credit card minimums that she never even knew I had been paying, and suddenly Megan was staring at numbers that didn't add up no matter how she rearranged them. The math was simple and brutal. She had never been truly independent. She had never had to be. First, our parents supported her through everything, and then I supported her without her even knowing about it, and she had floated through her entire adult life, genuinely believing she was surviving on her own, when really she was being carried by everyone around her. Now, for the first time ever, she was looking at what her life actually cost, and realizing she couldn't afford to be herself. My mother's voicemails changed dramatically over those weeks. The first few were accusatory and sharp, filled with hurt and righteous anger. "How could you do this to your family, Lindsay? After everything we've been through together, just disappearing like this without any warning and leaving us to deal with the mess you created." Then the tone shifted gradually to pleading and desperate. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't realize how much you were doing for us all these years. Please come home so we can talk about this face to face. We can work it out as a family." By the third week of January, the voicemails were just my mother crying quietly into the phone. No words at all, just soft sobs and shaky breathing before she finally hung up. I listened to every single one of those messages. I saved them in a folder on my phone labeled Proof. And I didn't respond to any of them. Karen worried about me at first. She kept asking if I was okay, if I wanted to talk about what happened, if maybe I should consider calling my mother back just to clear the air between us. But as the days passed and she watched me sleep peacefully through entire nights without any nightmares, watched me laugh genuinely at silly movies without that haunted look behind my eyes, watched me pack for Denver with something that almost looked like real excitement, she finally stopped asking those questions. "You're lighter," she told me one evening as we sat together on her back porch drinking tea and watching the winter stars. "I don't think I've ever seen you like this in all the years I've known you." She was absolutely right. For the first time in 4 years, I wasn't carrying my family on my back. The weight was completely gone, and I could finally breathe again. And just when the Floyd family thought things couldn't possibly get any worse, Megan received the letter she had been dreading. The Porsche, that gleaming white symbol of everything my parents valued about my sister, and everything they had dismissed about me, was being repossessed. She had 30 days to return the car she had shown off to the entire world on Christmas morning. Before I left Cincinnati for Denver, I sat down at Karen's kitchen table one last time and wrote an email to my entire family. I had thought about calling, thought about having one final conversation to explain everything, but I realized that phone calls could be interrupted, words could be twisted, and emotions could take over before I said what needed to be said. An email would let me speak without being cut off, and it would exist as a permanent record of exactly where I stood. I kept the message simple and direct. I'm not cutting off this family. But from now on, I will only maintain a relationship if there is real respect, and that respect has to be shown through actions, not just words. I will not financially support anyone anymore. I'm done being treated as a silent ATM instead of a daughter. If you want to see me, I'm open to it, but I will not return home until I feel genuinely valued for who I am, not just what I can provide. I read it over 3 times, changed nothing, and hit send. Then I loaded the last box into my car and drove west toward my new life. Denver was everything I needed it to be. The job offer had come through just before Christmas, a finance director position at a growing company with a 40% salary increase and actual room for advancement. I found a small apartment on the edge of the city with a balcony that looked out over the Rocky Mountains. Every morning I drank my coffee watching the sun rise over those peaks, and every evening I watched them turn pink and gold as the day ended. I started seeing a therapist for the first time in my life, a gentle woman named Dr. Reyes, who helped me understand that my family's treatment of me was never about my worth. It was about their inability to see beyond their own needs. The sessions were hard at first. I cried more in those early months than I had cried in the previous 4 years combined. But slowly I started to heal. I started to understand that being strong didn't mean carrying everyone else. It meant knowing when to put myself down and walk away. One afternoon in March, I walked past a boutique window and saw a designer handbag I had admired for over 2 years. It was beautiful, simple, exactly my style. I had never bought it because every time I considered it, I told myself the money should go to my family instead. They needed it more than I needed a purse. But that day, I walked into the store, tried it on, and handed over my credit card without a single moment of guilt. It was the first real gift I had ever given myself, and carrying it out of that store felt like carrying proof that I finally mattered to someone. That someone was me. Back in Columbus, the Floyd family was being forced to grow up for the first time. I heard bits and pieces through Karen, who still had mutual friends in the area. My parents downsized their lifestyle dramatically, selling furniture and electronics, and all the unnecessary luxuries they had accumulated over the years. They learned to live within their actual means, which turned out to be much more modest than they had pretended for so long. My father took on extra consulting work to help cover the bills that I was no longer paying. My mother started couponing and cooking at home instead of ordering takeout 3 times a week. It wasn't poverty, but it was reality, and reality was something they had been avoiding for a very long time. Megan returned the Porsche at the end of January, exactly 30 days after receiving the repossession notice. She cried when she handed over the keys, according to the friend who told Karen, but there was nothing anyone could do. She couldn't afford it, and neither could my parents. For the first time in her life, Megan had to get a real job. Not a part-time position at a boutique where she could chat with friends and leave early whenever she felt like it, but a full-time job at an insurance office, 40 hours a week, with actual responsibilities and actual consequences if she didn't show up. It was entry-level work. Nothing glamorous, but it was honest. Slowly over the following months, Megan began to understand something she had never grasped before. Her privileges had never been free. They had come at her sister's expense, paid for in silence and sacrifice, and years of being invisible. My father contacted the family lawyer sometime in February and had the will revised. The new version split everything 50-50 between me and Megan. He didn't tell me about it directly, but the lawyer sent me a copy for my records. I read it once, filed it away, and didn't think about it again. It wasn't about the money. It was about being seen as equal, finally, even if it took losing everything for them to realize I deserved it. 2 months after Christmas, my phone rang with a Columbus area code. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Megan. Her voice was small and uncertain, nothing like the confident, careless tone she had always used with me before. "Lindsay," she said, "I need to say something, and I need you to just listen." I stayed silent and let her speak. "I'm sorry. I knew you were paying for things. I knew it for years, and I never thanked you. I never even acknowledged it. I just took and told myself it was fine because you had more than me. I didn't realize how terrible I was being until I had to handle everything myself, until I had to sit down and look at bills and figure out how to pay them and realize that I've never actually done that before in my entire life." She paused, and I could hear her breathing shakily on the other end of the line. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just needed you to know that I finally understand." I sat with her words for a long moment before responding. "Thank you for saying that," I said quietly. "But you need time to prove it through actions, not just words. I've heard a lot of apologies in my life that didn't mean anything once the crisis passed. Show me you've changed, and maybe someday we can rebuild something real." I hung up without saying goodbye. It wasn't cruelty. It was honesty. And for the first time, I think Megan actually heard me. 3 months after Christmas, my mother drove to Denver alone. She didn't call ahead, didn't warn me she was coming. Just showed up at my apartment building and asked the doorman to ring my unit. I almost didn't let her up. But something in his description of her, a tired-looking older woman who had been crying in her car for 20 minutes before coming inside, made me press the button to open the lobby door. She stood in my doorway, looking smaller than I remembered, older, like the past few months had aged her a decade. She didn't ask to come in. She didn't ask me to come home. She just looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and said, "I'm sorry. I was so worried about Megan all these years that I became completely blind to you. You were the daughter who loved this family through actions every single day, and I never once acknowledged it. I never once said thank you. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to hear it from my mouth." I listened to every word. I didn't hug her. I didn't cry. But I didn't turn her away either. "I heard you," I said. "I need time." 6 months after that Christmas, my mother visited Denver again. This time, I invited her inside for tea. We sat on my small balcony looking out at the mountains and didn't talk very much. But it was a beginning. A relationship no longer built on one-sided sacrifice, but on something that might eventually become mutual respect. That evening after she left, I sat alone watching the sunset paint the Rockies in shades of gold and purple, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Real peace. I didn't cut off my family. I just stopped cutting away pieces of myself to fit into their expectations. And from that Christmas forward, no one in the Floyd family ever dared to treat me as the one who doesn't need anything again. Not because I proved my worth with money, but because I finally proved that my love was never something they were entitled to take for granted. And that is where Lindsay's story ends, at least for now. A woman who spent 4 years silently holding her family together, asking for nothing in return, only to receive $2 and a lecture about gratitude on Christmas morning. But instead of breaking down, instead of begging for the love she deserved, Lindsay made a choice. She chose herself. She walked away from the table, canceled every payment she had been making in the shadows, and let her family finally see what their lives looked like without her invisible support. Some people might call that revenge. I call it self-respect. What strikes me most about this story is how common it really is. So many of us have been the Lindsay in our families, the one who shows up every time, the one who fixes every problem, the one who sacrifices quietly, while watching others receive praise and gifts and attention for simply existing. We tell ourselves that love means giving without expecting anything back. But there is a difference between generous love and being taken for granted. There is a difference between supporting your family and disappearing into a role where your only value is what you provide. Lindsay's story reminds us that boundaries are not selfish. Walking away from people who hurt you is not cruel, and demanding to be treated with respect even from the people who are supposed to love you most is not asking for too much. It is asking for the bare minimum. I want to hear from you. Have you ever been the invisible one in your family? Have you ever given everything to people who never seemed to notice? Or maybe you have been on the other side, realizing too late that someone you loved was carrying more than you ever knew. Whatever your experience, your story matters. And I would love to hear it in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about your own family or your own boundaries, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Every subscription helps us continue bringing you stories like this one. Stories about real people facing real struggles and finding the strength to reclaim their lives. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications so you never miss a new story, and share this video with someone who might need to hear it today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember, your worth is not measured by how much you sacrifice for others. Your worth is inherent, and anyone who makes you feel otherwise does not deserve a seat at your table. Until next time, take care of yourself. You deserve it.